This is my new Patreon Series 11 concerning Yeshua's Halakah of spiritual rebirth. I've written a short book introducing Yeshua's Halakah of spiritual rebirth. It's called Incarnating the New Humanity, Practicing Yeshua's Lost Halakah for Spiritual Rebirth. Those who make Patreon pledges of $2 or more to support my work creating these YouTube videos on the pre-Christian teachings of Jesus receive a link to this PDF file. In this presentation, I will offer an overview to what is contained in the book. It can also be purchased online as a Kindle edition for $9.99, and I sell the paperback edition only in my workshops and for $10. I don't have them on online bookstores. If you would like to sponsor or help set up one of my Yeshua PowerPoint presentations in your home or spiritual community, please contact me by email through the Keizer channel on YouTube. So now let's ask, what is Halakah? Well, Hebrew Halakah, which literally means the path that one should walk, is based on interpretation of divine spiritual law in Scripture by a sage in the 1st century, or after AD 70-80, a rabbi in the 2nd century and forward. It's transliterated with different spellings. It can be Halakah or Halakah with an H, a soft H, and so on. In Yeshua's era, different Jewish sages expounded their own variations of halakhic interpretation. The Halakah of Hillel, for example, allowed a Jewish man to divorce his wife for burning his dinner, while the Halakah of Shammai forbade divorce of a wife for any cause except adultery. Obviously, Yeshua agreed with the Halakah of Shammai on this issue. Sages like Yeshua were asked to rule on issues like which biblical commandments or mitzvot were most important to observe, which were the heaviest. It was usually ruled that those coming directly from Yahweh or the mouth of Yahweh in Scripture were the heaviest, like the Decalogue or the Ten Commandments. According to Luke 10:29, Yeshua answered the challenge of a Pharisaic scriptural expert to name the weightiest commandments, which he did by quoting Deuteronomy, love God with all thy heart, etc., and Leviticus, love your neighbor as yourself. The word love in these commandments, by the way, is Hebrew ahav, meaning to cherish or devote oneself to fully. It's different than in Yeshua's misunderstood love of enemies, which was a Hebrew word for love, meaning to treat them with covenantal fairness and respect. It didn't mean you had to have sentimental feelings about your enemies. However, the Halakah of Yeshua went beyond simple legalistic rulings on scriptural mitzvot. He expanded the midrashic Kabbalistic insights of the Jewish sages into a grand vision of Halakah for a spiritually self-rebirthing humanity tasked with becoming worthy to exercise divine sovereignty, Malkuth, in order to bring the Messianic age into manifestation on earth. I describe this as Yeshua's Halakah of spiritual rebirth. Yeshua's Halakah was described in John's Gospel as the way of overcoming the world, the flesh, and the devil. In simplest form, as he expounded it publicly, it can be compared with Gautama's eightfold path as a foundation for the advanced practices leading to self-liberation. Now, Yeshua taught a spiritual regeneration into a new form of humanity, which Christians called Christhood, through self-liberation from bondage to evil, to following the Yetzer Hara that had dominated human history up to that current time. The goal of his Halakah was the spiritual rebirth of a new archetypal humanity, a second or new Adam, and the word Adam means mankind, humanity. Adam was originally androgynous and represented both the sexes of all humanity. In Aramaic, this was the Bar Enosh, or son of man Messiah, son of mankind Messiah, prophesied by the 2nd century BC Babylonian schools of Daniel and Enoch. The Greek translation of Messiah, or Anointed One, is Christ. And the term that Yeshua uses constantly, we find it used over 81 times, regarding the Messiah, is Son of Man, Bar Enosh. He is not speaking of the Davidic Messiah, a son of David, or of the Messiah ben Joseph. He's speaking of the Son of Man Messiah. Daniel 7:13-14. I saw in the night visions, or prophetic dream, and behold, there came with the clouds, or mysteries of the heavens, one like unto a son of man, a human being, meaning as opposed to the beasts. And in the prophetic dream of Daniel, this one like unto a son of man, or like a human being in human form, is contrasted to the ages past of beasts who have ruled the earth, representing different dynasties that have enslaved mankind, etc. And now this new being comes, this one like unto a son of man, a son of Adam. And he came even to the Ancient of Days, and they brought him near before him. And there was given him dominion and glory and a sovereignty. That word is Malkuth, wrongly translated in Christianity as kingdom, that all the peoples, nations, and languages should serve in him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away, and his sovereignty shall not be destroyed. Well, this concept of one like unto a son of man became very quickly the Son of Man, the Bar Enosh in Aramaic. And in the Enochian literature that comes very soon afterwards, it is identified with the coming Messiah. It's a new humanity, however. It's not a single individual. It develops as a basic prophecy of the 1st century BC Son of Man Messiah, which is a collective new archetypal humanity, as elaborated further in the same prophecy a few lines later in Daniel. He says, the divine sovereignty and the dominion and the greatness of the angelic sovereignties under the whole sky shall be given to the people of the holy ones of the Most High. And so this sovereignty that goes to this archetypal new human being, the Bar Enosh, the son or heir or next evolution of mankind, this divine sovereignty belongs to not a single individual, but a new humanity, a new people of the holy ones. So Yeshua's Son of Man, Messiah, was a corporate archetypal new humanity, not an individual person like the Davidic Messiah of Paul and the Judean Pharisees and the New Testament Christians, and as they still celebrate it today. So see my 2 presentations on the Son of Man in the Louis Keizer YouTube channel. The Son of Mankind Messiah, or Christ, was a spiritual evolution of humanity, a second Adam, designed to liberate the first humanity and its world from its self-created spiritual bondage to the interior forces of evil, represented in Jewish thought by the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination. And the Halakah of Yeshua was a modality of daily spiritual practice to generate rebirth of the soul and transform disciples into living Christs to usher in the Messianic age on earth. Now, to set the scene, we have to understand that Yeshua was not going around proclaiming that he was the Messiah, nor was his message that he was going to die to save mankind from its sins or be a sacrifice to God on the cross, and that people had to believe in him in order to be saved from damnation and judgment. The idea of an eschatological judgment was not part of the teaching of Yeshua. He was a Galilean Pharisaic sage. He was not Palestinian. The reason that he attacked the Judean Pharisees was not because they were Jewish, as as the later anti-Semitic Christian Gospels would seem to imply, or because they were wrong about all kinds of issues. He was very well versed in all their schools of thought, but in Galilean Pharisaism, there was a very strong opposition to the idea of legalization, the creation of many new kinds of laws and rules that people had to follow. And there was also not an emphasis upon the idea of a coming judgment and a Davidic Messiah who would come out of the sky and would destroy Rome and the enemies and so on. In Yeshua's Pharisaic view, which was Galilean, which was much more characteristically shamanic, it was concerned with healing, it was concerned with prophecy and psychic and other forms of ministry that are different than the legalistic forms of the Judean Pharisees, and it was had much more in common with the prophetic tradition of the northern kingdom, and it also, as a tradition in Pharisaism, had more connections, closer connections to the Babylonian culture, where Hillel and other great sages originally studied. That was the cultural center of Judaism. The Jewish diaspora had created Judaism all over the world, and synagogues were in Rome and they were in Ephesus and all kinds of places. But Babylon, the original exile, the original Babylonian exile, had developed a community that became the cultural center of Judaism in the ancient world. Jerusalem was the center for cultic worship, and it was a place to which people would make pilgrimage, but it was not a place where people stayed and lived, and it was much controlled by the Sanhedrin and the Romans, and it was under Roman occupation. However, the Roman occupation did not exist in Babylon, and the Babylonian forms of understanding of the Messiah, the Son of Man Messiah, were based much more on the idea of a changing and new kind of humanity that would come into being, and that the earth would not suffer a catastrophic judgment or some eschatological event, but rather would be cleansed and sanctified over a long period of time, as described, for example, in the book of Jubilees, where little by little the earth would be sanctified and the Messianic age would be brought in. And how would it be done? By the saints of the Messianic age, by those who had taken upon themselves and become worthy of the angelic sovereignties, the powers of that the angels had mastery over, and that would be given eventually to human beings. And so that was what sovereignty was. It was not kingdom, it was, you might say, kingship or rulership. So Yeshua was not teaching that one had to believe in something in order to be saved from an eschatological judgment. He was teaching faithfulness. The word in Aramaic and Hebrew does not mean belief. Emunah means fidelity, perseverance, like the faithfulness of a mustard seed. That's why it grows to be the greatest of all bushes. It's because it faithfully persists, it perseveres. And that's what Yeshua taught. And he taught that one became liberated from one's own sins and the hub, or the bad karma of the past, through no longer holding thoughts of vengeance against those who sinned against you yourself. In other words, you could actually, you might call it a science of self-liberation, where one becomes freer and freer of the karmic bondage, or the bondage of sin that one has committed in past lives, through the forgiveness of those who sin against you. It sounds magical, but it's a form of reality that Yeshua was very aware of, and he advocated very strongly. So he was speaking about a halakha that involved self-liberation and self-transformation and self-rebirth. I want to emphasize this because it's very similar to the ideas that were taught by Gautama, who was called Buddha. Now, the halakha of Yeshua was misunderstood in the early Greek-speaking Gentile churches. Yeshua had taught self-liberation through the Jewish concept of good works and purification of motives. So we might compare, for example, the contemporary first century first Baruch that says, "But those who have been liberated by their works will achieve the Chema," what Christians call it the resurrection, but the Chema is the continuity of consciousness after death. "And they shall be made like unto the angels." So these are the concepts that are being worked with in the halakha of Yeshua. The most ancient and authentic summary of Yeshua's halakha can be found in the New Testament epistle transmitting the apostolic tradition of James the Righteous, Yaakov Hatzadik, the physical brother of Yeshua and the leader of the Jerusalem church, who in his own right had become respected as a Jewish hakim and saint, totally separate from his brother Yeshua. Now, this letter of James is a very precious document because it preserves the halakhic teachings of Jewish Christianity before they were distorted by the Greek churches. And even though it was not written by James, nor was the other brother, the letter attributed to the other brother of Yeshua, which is Jude, written by the brother of Jesus, but they do represent the traditions or the teachings that were associated with those apostles. So this is the teaching associated with James, and it preserves what Yeshua was teaching. In it, the writer satirizes the Pauline idea that Christian faith is belief, and shows rather that faith, emunah, faithfulness, can exist only as works. Faith without works is dead. But New Testament Christianity taught about salvation from judgment through belief in Jesus. So we have the Epistle of James, faith without works is dead, and we can contrast it to the statement in the 3rd chapter of the very late Gospel of John, written at the end of the 1st century: "Whosoever believeth in him should not perish but have eternal life." Well, if that were to say something like, "Whosoever keep faith with him and his teaching," then that would make a lot more sense in terms of the teachings of Yeshua. So we need to take a look here at the early Christian forms of mystic practice. Yeshua was not an ascetic renunciate like John the Baptist. He was criticized as a wine bibber and a glutton, and matter of fact. And he was asked, why do John's disciples and the disciples of the Pharisees fast, but your disciples do not fast? Implying that he's very not rigid, not disciplinarian, and actually he's thought of as being a one who eats too much food and drinks too much wine and all this sort of thing. This is not what Yeshua was doing. It's what he was accused of, because he was not an ascetic. And he kept faithful to what we might call a middle way, not an extreme way. But by the 2nd and 3rd centuries, proto-Orthodox Christian practice was interpreted mainly in terms of renunciation, asceticism, and glorification of Christian martyrdom. However, the halakhic techniques taught by Yeshua concerning self-liberation through interior purification were undoubtedly reflected in what we call the hesychastic or silent or isolated spiritual practices of the 3rd to 5th century desert fathers and desert mothers. Hesychism hesychasm is a practice of silence and isolation, and that was undoubtedly part of the practices that Yeshua taught his apostles, but he did not teach them asceticism. He did not teach them, oh, you must not be married and blah blah blah. He taught them to live in the world and interact, and it was in the interactions of life in the world and in flesh that his halakhic practice was done, of compassion and so on. So as I say, hesychasm reflects the earlier Gnostic or Hermetic view of divine sige, or silence. You might remember from an earlier presentation that sige, or silence, is the deity from which all others arise. And Yeshua's shachad, or vigil, was probably the origin of Gnostic Christian practices of silent meditation. Now, the apophthegmata patrum, or the sayings of the Desert Fathers, that exhibit parallels between early Christian and Buddhist practice, were popularized by the Trappist monk Thomas Merton in the mid-20th century. You can get a very excellent short edition. It's a very short book he put together, but the sayings of the Desert Fathers is a huge collection that is difficult to get a hold of except in scholarly libraries. So I would suggest that you might want to look at or purchase for yourself, it's not that expensive, The Wisdom of the Desert Fathers, or other writings by Merton about the sayings and the teachings of the Desert Fathers, because they do preserve certain aspects of the original practices and teachings of Yeshua. not their asceticism, but their concepts. I'll show you some examples. Even though asceticism was respected as being the sign of holiness in the ancient world, and therefore in order to be respected as saints and and enlightened people, many of the early Christians became ascetic, and they became isolated and so on. That was not what Yeshua taught people. It was a way of interacting with other people in life. And so even in the midst of their hesychism and asceticism, the Desert Fathers preserve concepts that are definitely part of Yeshua's teaching. Let's also remember that many of these were desert mothers, and you can get an excellent book showing the sayings and the lives and stories of early Christian women by Laura Swan. So I recommend both Thomas Merton and Laura Swan. Here's an example of what Merton quotes from the Desert Fathers. A brother came to Setus to visit Abba Moses. All these people were called Appa or Abba Moses, and asked him for a word. You know, he wanted a teaching. The old man said to him, "Go sit in your cell, and your cell will teach you everything." So this is the reverence for silence and the teaching that in order to learn one must go within. And this is definitely a teaching of Yeshua. The Malkuth of the heavens is within you. Abba Poiman said, to throw yourself before God, to not measure your progress, to leave behind all self-will, these are the instruments for the work of the soul. Because the work of the soul is interior, and as Yeshua taught, it is the intentions that matter. You need to learn to discriminate between the evil inclination and the good inclination of the heart. A brother questioned Abba Arsenius to hear a word of him, and the old man said to him, strive with all your might to bring your interior activity into accord with God, and you will overcome exterior passions. So these ideas that the work of the soul is interior is definitely part of the transformative halakha that Yeshua taught people, but of course it has been developed now into an ascetic form of practice by the 3rd, 4th, 5th centuries. So I have divided, in order for us to understand the halakha of Yeshua, in my book into what I call outer, inner, and secret halakha, much as it's done with in other schools of self-development that are Buddhist and other forms, so that we can better understand what they are. And in the book we go into much more detail, but I'm just giving you an overview here. Internal and external practice is the essential vehicle for spiritual self-transformation in any religious tradition, and originally it was so in Yeshua's halakha. But in addition to inner and outer halakha, Yeshua initiated his closest disciples into a form of the work of the chariot, the Merkaba ascent. I refer to this as secret halakha. So internal and external practices, inner and outer halakha, and the advanced practice of interior experience is secret halakha. Now this secret halakha survived only among inner circles that transmitted it one-to-one and never wrote about it, with the exception of Paul in 2 Corinthians, who wrote about his Merkaba experience. Evidence of it is preserved in the Gospels with the Transfiguration story and Yeshua's giving of initiatic names to closest disciples, as well as in the Gospel of Mary and various so-called Gnostic Christian revelations discussed in the last video. They were probably what Clement of Alexandria referred to as the, quote, hieratic or hierophantic teachings, or, quote, the things that are not to be uttered, in his letter concerning the secret Gospel of Mark. Not to be uttered means not to be spoken except privately from the mouth of a teacher into the ear of a single disciple. So let's examine these three categories: outer, inner, and secret halakha. In Palestine, there was a long-standing negative cultural attitude towards the poor, the Ebionim. And Yeshua's attempt to assist and help the poor and the sick was part of his outer halakha, and that was what he taught his disciples. Halakah of compassion. Now, there was a philosophy in Judaism that is called the Deuteronomic philosophy, expressed in the book of Deuteronomy before the time of the exile. And in it, the idea was that God would reward the good in this life and would punish the evil in this life, and therefore the poor and sick were considered to have brought their misfortunes upon themselves, and God was punishing them for being evil. The rich were wealthy because they were righteous and beloved by God, and so God gave them reward. The poor were miserable because they were sinners and despised by God. Well, you might think that's a terrible way to think, but all you have to do is look at politics in America and the views of libertarians and extremely conservative Republicans about these things. This is a very common attitude that people have. They're poor, they're lazy, and they deserve what they don't have. Now, Yeshua taught that the self-righteous hardness of heart or lack of compassion was a far worse sin in the eyes of God than any petty theft done by a poor beggar. Many poor villages do not have a synagogue food distribution system. In the larger cities, the synagogues were the collection place for food for the poor, and for school people were taught to read, and that was open to everybody regardless of your income. The world's first social services were created by Jewish culture, and the synagogues were the place where these services were distributed. But in the poor villages where Yeshua went, they did not have a synagogue, or if they did, they didn't have a food distribution system or other things. In wealthy cities like Jerusalem, lepers or anyone with a skin disease that ostracized them from society, because it was all called leprosy, but any kind of skin disease meant that you had some kind of a curse from God. Homeless people and beggars and so-called lepers lived miserable lives in these big cities in spite of the fact that there were distribution centers. Many of these were women who had been divorced by their husbands and fell into lives of abject poverty, because husbands could divorce their wives by simply publicly declaring, "We are divorced now," and the wife was now homeless. And if she had no one she can go and live with, she had to do whatever she could in order to survive. And that was one of the reasons that Yeshua said, compared divorcing a wife to committing adultery, committing infidelity to God. Now, Yeshua took direct responsibility for the welfare of poor beggars and others of the Ebionim. They were known as the poor, by organizing his disciples to solicit and distribute money to provide them with food and comfort and necessities. And by the way, one of the earliest sects of Jewish Christianity, Messianic Christianity, were the Ebionites, the Ebionim. The word Ebion, a poor one, became a term that was used in Christianity later in monasticism, the poor ones of charity and so on. And the idea of poverty was an important monastic ideal. And even in the first century, people who became disciples of Yeshua in Jewish Christianity gave their goods to the entire community and took upon themselves, so to speak, a vow of poverty. And so the poor were held in very high esteem. They were not blamed. Were not considered to have by Yeshua and the early Christians to have become poor because they were sinful and God was punishing them. So that Deuteronomic concept of the righteous are rewarded here on earth, and the just and so on, whereas the unrighteous and the unjust suffer here on earth. The philosophy that was disputed so much and is gone over again and actually refuted in the book of Job, which is a series of discourses about this issue, was something that Yeshua was very sensitive to. So many people came out to meet the entourage that traveled with Yeshua. He didn't walk alone. He had disciples with him, male and female, and he had food with him, and he had donations with him. He traveled from village to village. So while his entourage was yet miles away, people would know that he was coming to their village, and wealthier people would open their homes and their property to Yeshua and his disciples, and they donated to help the poor. And people came out to meet the entourage, and it was announced that he was coming to their village because he would be, through his disciples, distributing food and money. Just remember that James, in his epistle, says, pure religious practice that is undefiled before Godhead, the Abba, is this: to aid and protect the vulnerable in their affliction. So that is basic to Yeshua's teaching, and this is Halakah, his outer Halakah. So this was a daily dynamic hands-on experience for the disciples to practice the outer Halakah of compassionate good works. It was also a dramatic way to proclaim the appearance of the Malkuth, of the sovereignty of God, of the coming rulership and dominance of the divine ways of justice and truth and compassion upon the earth and among humanity, which Yeshua proclaimed. Well, what about inner Halakah? Inner Halakah is based on a very important way of perceiving internally. It's a way of discriminating between what are called the good and evil inclinations of the heart. In Yeshua's view and in the Jewish view, there were two inclinations of the heart that came into the human heart at the very creation of mankind, of Adam. And the word in Hebrew is Yetzer, which means a formation, and it was understood to be also an inclination. There was the good formation, there's a good Yetzer and the evil Yetzer. The Yetzer HaTov is the good Yetzer, the Yetzer HaRa is the evil inclination. Modern Jewish people still say prayers for God to assist them to overcome the evil Yetzer and to follow the advice, the inclinations of the good Yetzer. Very often we hear of the legend of Yeshua's temptation in the desert. After his baptism by John in the Gospels, he goes out to the desert and spends 40 days and 40 nights alone in silence. And he then is tempted by Shaitan, Satan. Very often, though, in early art, this is portrayed with Yeshua with two tempters on either side. On one side, the angelic ones who will minister to him. This is the good Yetzer. And on the other side, the Shaitan, Satan, who tries to get him to follow a false path. And what is that false path? The false path is selfishness, ego. And what is the good path? What is the way of God? It is selflessness. And that's the simplest way to describe the difference Both these impulses exist at the same time in the human heart and consciousness as their motivation. We are ambivalent beings. We have always more than one. We have a polarized form of inspiration within our hearts that comes to us. And if we don't learn to wisely not follow the what are called the evil inclinations, the selfish inclinations, and to follow the selfless ones, then we find ourselves in bondage to that. It's a habit we can't break. It's like smoking or pornography or something like that. It's a habit that has us in its grips, and we are now its servant. We are mastered by it. And that is the concept of why we must discriminate between the good and the evil inclinations. The Yetzer Hara, or evil inclination, selfishness, is characterized by self-centered egoism, seeking what is perceived as short-term pleasure or personal gain, lack of foresight about the consequences for others of the actions that we take, an accompanying mental rationale that seeks to justify these words and these actions, and the use of subterfuge and guile. And they will produce always, ultimately, negative consequences. So this is the evil inclination, learning to discriminate between the evil and the good. The Yetzer HaTov, or the good inclination, which is rooted in eternal and divine reality within each heart, is characterized by an attitude of compassion, a desire to benefit and cooperate with others by serving through one's position and talents in life, foresight and care for consequences of words and actions, with a willingness to compromise, to recognize the validity of other points of view, and choose the lesser or least of evils if necessary. Forthrightness, honesty, and transparency in all dealings is characteristic of the good inclination. The positive consequences of following this inclination far outweigh possible unintended negative consequences. So this is the basic view of what inner Halakah is, of which there are many techniques that Yeshua talks about that I discuss in the book. Now, other parts of inner Halakah include what is described as singleness of heart and purification of the soul. Once one's learned to discriminate between selfish and selfless motivation on the fly while you're in the middle of it, and to choose to follow the inclinations of the good Yetzer, the process of sanctification begins in the soul. This requires constant self-examination with suspension of judgmental attitude towards self and others. It's scientific. It's dispassionate. It's the kind of ideal we have for judges and other people. No bias. It involves, and can involve, and has in many spiritual traditions, a time of reflection in the evening before one goes to sleep at night. And this is not a form of meditation. This is a form of contemplation, where one looks back upon what one has done during the day and becomes aware of what one has done or said that one wishes one had not done or said, and what one did or said that one is happy that one did or said. And just by recognizing those, just by becoming aware of them, the habits will slowly change for the better. In Yeshua's teaching, the soul is either defiled or it's sanctified by our actions and reactions and interactions with others. How we act and react and interact determines to what extent the soul is defiled or sanctified. After death, the soul must be purified from that life through the form that is known as Gehenna. That is the basic concept that became in Catholic theology the idea of purgatory. But unlike Catholic theology, the Jewish concept of Gehenna was that most ordinary people would only experience that purification for a very short time, and that the maximum time anyone would experience it would be for 1 year, 1 solar year, not eternal damnation and so on. But that's the subject of other presentations. Singleness of heart and purification of the soul involves being the same person on the outside publicly as you are on the inside. Yeshua said in John's Gospel, when he saw Nathanael, to whom he had not yet been introduced but was going to be introduced, he said, "A true Israelite in whom is no guile." Guile is having different kinds of motives and hidden agendas on the inside that one doesn't reveal on the outside, and that's the opposite of singleness of heart, which is being the same person on the outside as you are on the inside. Then there is the teachings of Shalach, which is what I call the spiritual silence of non-retaliation. Non-retaliation for those who harm you or sin against you. Yeshua taught that while forgiveness doesn't make sin go away, the victim can mercifully release the perpetrator from the consequences of sin, the hub, or karmic debt owed to the victim, by forgiving, by releasing, by not holding on to anger and desires for revenge. And that frees two people. It frees the perpetrator and it frees the victim. It's part of his measure for measure teachings. In the same measure that you give, you will receive. In the same measure that you forgive, you will be forgiven. In the same measure that you release, you will be released. That's the spiritual science of non-retaliation or forgiveness. In the Lord's Prayer, we're all very familiar with the second clause. Release us from the consequences of sin, that is, not from our sins, but from the consequences of our sins, as we forgive those who sin against us. In the same measure that we release those who sin against us, please release us from the consequences of our sins. So this is a science of non-retaliation and self-liberation. Here's a little more on inner halakha that is covered in the book, and I'm just summarizing here. Tifla, correct and effective prayer. There are many forms of prayer, but the form of prayer that Yeshua taught, there were many forms of Hebrew prayer, but the forms of prayer that Yeshua taught was one form, and it was called Tifla. That is another name for that is intercessory prayer. It's not merely a one-time feel-good prayer for those in need. It's an active commitment to assisting those in need. It demands persistence and full participation. Intercessory intercessory prayer cannot be divorced from action. It requires the active participation of the intercessor. The Lord's Prayer is the most famous example of this kind of intercessory prayer, but prayer for enemies is intercessory. You don't pray for your enemies to be punished. You pray for your enemies to be released from their own bondage, to become compassionate. You pray for your enemies to grow up and become spiritually aware. That's an intercessory prayer, prayer for enemies. It's not just a thought or intention, it's a work. It's a thing that you do that has consequences. James says, if a brother or sister is naked and destitute of daily food, and one of you says to them, depart in peace, be warmed and filled, but you do not give them the things which are needed for the body, what does it profit? Thus also faith by itself, if it does not have works, is dead. Yeshua taught that prayer is private, not public. He said, but when you pray, enter into your private place, shut the door, and pray to your Abba who is hidden from this world. And the attitude of prayer, Yeshua taught, must be one of true and authentic humility. This includes recognition of one's personal, ignorant, blind, and egoistic nature in contrast to the holiness of Godhead. And by the holiness of Godhead we mean the consciousness of our own personal mundane brain is like the consciousness of an ant compared to the consciousness of a human being, but even far less than that. To understand that when we put ourselves into the presence of Godhead, of the whole, that we are tiny, tiny, small things, even like babies or children. So this is an awareness that must be reawakened and generated through contemplation before initiating prayer, because it's not part of normal consciousness. If it were, we'd all be hapless neurotics if we all realized how little we knew and how tiny our minds were and so on. It's not it's somewhat parallel to the Buddhist concept of generating bodhicitta before you begin a practice. Bodhicitta is compassion for all beings and the desire that all beings may be liberated. And this awareness of humility that was taught by Yeshua is an awareness not of being small and insignificant, but an awareness of being on the same footing as all beings, not just people, but animals and all things that manifest. And prayer must be done in the first person plural. We, us, our. It is not the first person singular, I, me, my. That is, prayer is for the community of oneself and others, not merely for self. It's like a bodhisattva commitment to the liberation of all beings, or a clear consciousness that oneself has no reality apart from all other beings. Thus it is always intercessory prayer. It is tifla. More of the inner halakha. We could talk about a more advanced inner halakha for the spiritually reborn, those who have taken upon themselves the yoke. They've accepted Yeshua as their guru, their master, their teacher. Singleness of heart was the first step toward developing spiritual perfection, or becoming shalem. In the Aramaic core of the Gospel of Thomas, we find the higher interior halakha described in this way. His disciples asked, "Shall we, being spiritually newly begotten ones, attain the sovereignty?" In other words, will we eventually attain full spiritual maturity and all the powers of a sage and a saint, and of the angels that are given for us to exercise on earth like you do, Master? And Yeshua replied, "When you make the inner as the outer, be the same person on the inside as you are on the outside," is one way of saying it. When you make the inner as the outer and the outer as the inner, the above is a below. And when you make the male and the female into a single unity, so that the male will not be merely masculine and the female merely feminine, and when you make human eyes to serve as God's eye, and a human hand to serve as God's hand, and a human foot to serve as God's foot, and a human image to serve as a divine image, then you shall attain the sovereignty. Well, to make human eyes to serve as God's eye could be the subject of a whole lecture, but basically, when you can view reality as it truly is and other people as they truly are, in the compassionate way that Godhead views all things, and a human hand to serve as God's hand, when the works that you do, the things that you accomplish, are accomplished for the divine purposes of compassion and justice and beauty, and a human foot to serve as God's foot, when you walk in the way, in the Halakah, in the path that leads to attunement with Godhead, and a human image to serve as the divine image. That is, when you are serving the ways of God on earth. I think it was Teresa of Avila, I'm not sure, who said that we are the fingers and hands of God, or of Christ. So when we bring that into manifestation through ourselves and our own bodies, then that is what is being spoken about here, is advanced inner Halakah for the spiritually reborn. Now, I have talked about secret Halakah, even more advanced Halakah. And here's evidence for secret teachings and secret practices. In Patreon presentation numbers 8 and 9, we examined the first century secret practice of Jewish Merkaba mystic ascent to the throne of Yahweh attributed to the prophets. Like we have a little representation here of Elijah ascending to heaven in a Merkaba, a chariot of fire. Now, Yeshua viewed himself as a prophet proclaiming a basor, or message to Israel, directly from the throne or Merkaba of God. And that implies a claim to have ascended to the 10th heaven, to the throne of God. If he has a message from the throne of God and he's a messenger, then he must have ascended to the throne of God. And how does one do that? Through Merkaba practice. We showed how evidence for initiatic ascent can be found in the early Christian canonical and non-canonical Gospels and Epistles and Apocalypses. For example, the Transfiguration. We examined the detailed ascent in the Gospel of Mary and the later Magdalenic legends of her daily ascents into the heavens. We've also examined some of the inner circle Kabbalistic and initiatic teachings of Yeshua that are found, for example, in the Aramaic core of the Gospel of Thomas. Paul claimed his ascent to the third heaven as evidence that he was an apostle chosen by Christ. And this implies that for Paul, the apostles must also have experienced the ascent. So it implies that it was knowledge that the apostles were able to make these ascents. And where did they learn it? They learned it from Yeshua. And we also examined the parallels between the legends of the ascension and the heavenly ascent in Merkaba. Finally, we examined Alexandrian, Christian, Sethian, Valentinian, and other early Gnostic claims to secret initiatic teachings and practices of Jesus and the apostles given only to advanced Christians. So let's take a look at Yeshua's secret halakha of ascent into the Shemayim as we can understand it. The most recent and comprehensive scholarly work on this topic is called Ascent to Heaven in Jewish and Christian Apocalypses by Martha Himmelfarb, Princeton University. It's difficult to get a hold of now. It was written, this last study was done in the 90s. And if you get the book, it costs $100 now. But it's excellent scholarship, and it's the most comprehensive one that's been done on this topic. From the narratives about Yeshua and certain of his Davrim, I infer the following things about his Mishkan of Merkaba ascent. The ascent was done in a seated posture. We can glean that from the Transfiguration, where the apostles are not standing as they would in prayer for long periods of time. It's done on a moonless night, or it could be done on a full moon. My speculation is it's done on the night after a full moon, when there may or may not appear a thin waxing crescent moon immediately after sunset, or done on a full moon as we have in the secret Gospel of Mark. New moon and full moon are still very important times for meditation in many religious traditions. It was done in complete privacy and seclusion. It was done after a week of spiritual instruction and preparation, and it required most of one night to actually accomplish the ascent. It was done with Yeshua as a guide. It required deep familiarity with the Enochian 10 Shemayim map of reality, which was envisioned with closed eyes and functioned as a mandala of the physical macrocosm and the spiritual olam of Godhead. Ascent was a process of entering deeply within one's heart, so it was probably understood as first a descent into interior depths, and then an ascent through the spiritual heavens through a hidden interior vehicle, the chariot, the Merkaba. In the description of the Gospel of Mary, she begins in the center of the earth in the lower elements and is brought up from there. The Merkaba heavenly journey began from the visualized interior of the earth and progressed upward, that is, inward, is what upward means, toward the throne of Godhead at the very center of reality, as in a Hindu or Tibetan mandala. So please click on the Patreon link in my description just below the video to become a patron, helping to sponsor my new videos on the pre-Christian teachings of Yeshua. And remember that for a $2 pledge for each of my videos, you will receive a PDF file to this book, Incarnating the New Humanity.